Hi and welcome. I used to do proper introductions, but due to audience preferences, we like to keep the introductions now very brief. So I'll put a link to your academic profile in the description. But for anyone who doesn't know what you do, you're a historian of science and technology at Manchester University, and your research sits at the intersection of where science, politics, diplomacy, and state power overlap. I've read many different aspects of your work and I found a lot to discuss, so we'll try and get through what we have time for. But maybe I was thinking we could start with a book that you wrote. You wrote a book called The Pontecorvo Affair, which is a true story about a man called Bruno Pontecorvo, who was a nuclear physicist in the 1950s. So yeah, introduce it and take it away. Tell us all about it.
Okay, yes. Obviously, just for the purpose of giving you a bit of a kind of introduction of why do we arrive at the Pontecorvo affair as a kind of my entry point, if you want, into what it was, academia, university, my career. Just to clarify, you're right, an historian of science and technology, but perhaps an unconventional one. For a number of years, historians of science and technology have looked fundamentally just at the processes of scientific discovery and how scientists have arrived at certain aspects of the processes of nature. More recently, there has been, if you want, I wouldn't call it a backlash, but certainly a rejection of what we call the internalist view. The idea that fundamentally we can explore what scientists do without looking at context. So we started looking as historians of science and technology more at context. To me, the context that perhaps was more intriguing was exactly how internationally scientists connect with each other, talk to each other, and how that dialogue and communication in turn influences the ways in which we can think of international relations between states, between societies, between places sometimes far apart. So that's where I see the focus on my research. And in a sense, the Pontecorvo affair was an ideal entry point into that story. This is a story of a scientist who, in the middle of, in 1950, decided to defect to the Soviet Union after having contributed to atomic energy research in Canada, but also to an extent in the United States. So the case itself, the case of a defection, triggered a major, if you want, international operations led by the security services to figure out where it was, because nobody knew that. And on top of that, obviously, a lot of media coverage, a lot of tensions between countries as well. I mean, who was responsible for having allowed this very important nuclear physicist to move on the other side of the Iron Curtain? That was how the newspapers framed the case. So in a sense, it was, for me, an ideal way to start testing some of my interests on, the kind of international dimensions of science and technology through a real case, a case where I could make my own contributions in terms of revealing something new with regards to my own historical research.
So if, for those who know less about the story, who was he, where did he come from, how did he end up in the job he had, and what made him run away?
Right, so Bruno Pontecorvo was one of the members of a famous group of physicists working in Rome, the so-called Via Panisperna school, Via Panisperna being the road where the Physics Institute was located. He was a pupil of Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi then moved from Rome to the United States in Chicago, where he was responsible for the experiment that proved nuclear fission possible, namely the possibility of actually harnessing atomic energy in a device or a system, a prototype of what we would consider today a nuclear reactor. So that was a decisive piece of research Pontecorvo wasn't directly involved in that piece of research, but obviously was in contact with Enrico Fermi throughout the period when he also moved to the United States after a stay in Paris for several years. He was essentially one of the leading nuclear physicists of his time, dealing with a number of issues that had to do with the development of particle physics, the rising field of understanding what particles are, what subparticles are, but also on top of that, also on the practical applications of nuclear physics at the time, and in particular this burgeoning field of atomic energy, the idea that we could harness energy out of nuclear reactions. Without going into further details, this is, however, the key piece of research that obviously allowed, on the one hand, peaceful exploitations of atomic energy, but on the other, the military applications, in particular the development of the atom bomb. Pontecorvo wasn't directly involved in the Manhattan Project, which is the project that, as we know, led eventually to the building of the devices that were used to end the war in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But he was involved in a number of other important pieces of research, also as part of a parallel project called the Tube Alloys Project. This was essentially a joint Canadian, British and French enterprise that ran in parallel with the Manhattan Project at another facility, not Los Alamos, but Chalk River in Canada, and that led to the production of a nuclear reactor. So we are talking about a physicist that had obviously a very distinctive profile, almost unique in the framework of what it was, the circumstances of the Second World War, and that at the end of the war, after a period where he was employed in the atomic energy research establishment of Howell in Britain, essentially made this very interesting and mysterious decision of moving to the Soviet Union.
What exact year is he doing this? And just situate the Soviet nuclear research effort in that time. Where are they up to? What's the kind of mood and setting in which this is happening?
So when he moves to the Soviet Union has already an ongoing atomic energy program. In 1949, they've tested the first device, codenamed in the West as Joe the First, Premia Molnia for the Soviets, First Lightning. And it was essentially already a program in an advanced stage, which obviously, with insight, throws perhaps a light about the fact that any contribution Pontecorvo could give to the Soviet atomic energy program, they were already well advanced in that direction. And so much of the speculation that happens after his defection focused on that, saying, in any case, that this contribution couldn't have been decisive. However, it was still something that was decisive, if you want, to the climate of the time. And this is pretty much where I frame it in the context of my book. Namely that, obviously, we know that in the immediate post-war years, scientists, and especially atomic scientists, are at the center of international attention because of the role they played, especially with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this new role that they have is also the subject of tensions, campaigns, especially in the United States. We know that they are targeted in the context of the witch hunt because obviously of the socialist and sometimes communist affiliations of some of them. For those of you who have seen Oppenheimer, obviously all of this will not sound particularly new. But if you haven't seen it, there's Pontecorvo. Pontecorvo as well at some point as a kind of socialist, leftist, scientist, or someone that is perceived that way, essentially decides to defect to the Soviet Union. And clearly that's a bit of a sensational case internationally because in a sense it's a challenge to what it's happening in the United States with regard to the witch hunts. The witch hunts is essentially that process whereby scientists who are not loyal to the U.S. government have been persecuted or, trialed in all sorts of ways. The defection of Bruno Pontecorvo is saying, hold on, if you keep, that kind of stance towards scientists, this is what it's going to happen. Scientists will leave. And this is exactly what eventually the message put out there will be in 1955 when when Pontecorvo suddenly reappears in Moscow, and in the running of a radio program, he declares, yes, I am here. After 5 years of mysterious disappearance, I am here. I've been here for the last 5 years, and the reason why I decided to come here is exactly that I couldn't actually cope anymore with the tensions, the anxieties, the apprehension that the witch hunt had produced within the scientific community.
So this is a time when obviously the Soviets have just shown that they have a bomb. So there's huge tension in the US. So this sort of raises the temperature. Contextually, Klaus Fuchs just beforehand, there had been a case, and this is the period when McCarthy, the senator, starts to kind of hunt down people who are seen as disloyal. And again, the question arises, was it the fact that he was looking for disloyal people that caused the problem, or was the fact that people were disloyal and were trying to get out of it? His brother is also involved in this. So just walk us through all of that kind of tension, which sort of raises the stakes in all of this.
So there's a direct connection, as in by March 1950, Klaus Fuchs confesses to have passed on information in specific circumstances I will not talk about here, but to Soviet agents that instigates a security case that entails the participation of both the American security services and the British security services. As parts of that investigation, Bruno Pontecorvo as well has been vetted before during the war, so he has already kind of been vetted by the security service, but he's vetted again. He's investigated, he's been interrogated by an MI5 security official, and in that investigation, it emerges that his brother, he has indeed the membership of the Italian Communist Party.
And is it fair to say there's a different security environment going on here? Because in the war, obviously the enemy is Nazi Germany and Japan. Yeah. Now the enemy was the once ally, so you could have had massive Soviet sympathies in the war and not be seen as a security threat, but that changes hugely in 5 years later.
It certainly does. Obviously, with the world divided by the Iron Curtain, East versus West, declarations that are obviously increasing tensions from both the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. The upcoming, obviously, the crisis in Berlin, the upcoming conflict in Korea. There's all sorts of situations that obviously, if you want, ignite further the case, right? But there is where, unfortunately, the kind of direct evidence we have stops, suggesting that actually what Pontecorvo declared when he reappeared in Moscow in 1955 wasn't that far from truth, as in he was more a victim of a situation that was increasingly making him anxious, rather than a contributor to espionage operations that had been developing in the West. To these days, we haven't got any final evidence that would confirm that he ever passed any type of information from the kind of context of research where he was working on. We have it, for instance, for others, but not for him, to Soviet agents. So it seems, but obviously there is where obviously historical research leaves us with a great deal of uncertainty, that indeed he was fundamentally unhappy and dissatisfied with his role. He also was offered essentially to leave Harwell after it was found that his brother had a communist membership association, and to go to Liverpool. He didn't want to move to Liverpool. His wife was also unhappy about living in Liverpool.
No one
Let's
wants to
say
move to Liverpool.
nobody wants to move to Liverpool.
But for any of the Liverpool fans, it's just a joke.
Yeah. Your joke, not mine, eh?
All on me, all on me.
Yes, but what I'm saying is just that essentially there were a number of contextual circumstances that made him prone to sudden and perhaps erratic decisions. And this is where my book perhaps makes a good contribution. Another cousin was someone very influential in the Italian Communist Party. It might be that during the summer of 1950, where he makes a lot of different strange decisions while on holiday in Italy, made an interesting suggestion. Okay, fine. You're struggling because you don't want to move to Liverpool. You're struggling because you can't stay at Harwell because of the investigation. I have a proposition for you. Why don't you move to Moscow? And, this is what seems to be essentially the true story, that in that moment he made that sudden decision, which wasn't something that physicists of that generation were unlikely to do. I mean, let's think about this physicist as moving across various countries. He essentially had to flee Paris because of obviously of the invasion of German troops of France, and he did it suddenly with two other colleagues taking some bikes and going with bikes from Paris to Lisbon. So that's a bit obviously of a sudden decision. So he was replicating that kind of approach, I think, in that very dramatic moment for him, where he was either, we will continue investigating you as a spy, or you move to Liverpool. And I didn't like that kind of diktat. He didn't like that kind of ultimatum, if you want. And he said, no, I decide for myself, I'll go to Moscow.
I think that tidbit about him taking a bike to Lisbon is quite informative for people who are not really immersed in this period. People look back and they see the Soviet Union, they see the Cold War, and they think, well, if you're moving to Moscow over Liverpool, this is an insanity, you must be a spy. But it must also be said that this is a time when knowledge about Stalin and the Soviet Union was still foggy. There was definitely information out there, but there was a lot of debate. So just expand a little bit on the attitudes of the time.
And there was also a strong belief in the fact that while the United States was fundamentally interested in developing a nuclear arsenal, the Soviet Union was working towards ensuring peace internationally. How much that was naive is not for me to say. We all know that now. But at the time, there were plenty of Western organizations affiliated, for instance, with socialist and communist parties, such as, for instance, the Peace Partisans, actively campaigning for means to actually put pressure on the United States especially, to renounce to atomic weaponry. And there is certainly scope to believe that Bruno Pontecorvo was fascinated by that, whether it was real or not. I mean, he eventually, at the end of his career, realized that much of what he believed when he left was pretty much non-existent in the Soviet Union, and he was open about how his socialist dream was ultimately, deluded. But I mean, at that point, he really believed that he could find a way to pursue nuclear physics and particle physics in the Soviet Union in ways that wouldn't make him complicit to atomic weapons programs. So that it was on that dream that much of the defection, I think, happened.
So following that dream, do we know what happened to him and his family in the subsequent years? Or
he went to work in Dubna, which is one of the most important nuclear physics, particle physics center in the former Soviet Union. And there, I mean, we know from his publications that his major contributions were on particles, subparticles. It was one of those who actually pioneered research on neutrinos. I'm not going to say what neutrinos are, but I mean, that was his field of expertise. The key kept being reportages, news, sensationalist news media from the east, from behind the Iron Curtain, suggesting that he was also contributing to all sorts of other things, the search for uranium, for instance, which was something was particularly which he had researched quite extensively before defecting, research on nuclear reactors as well. There were hypotheses about potential contributions also to atomic weapons programs, but again, I stress my own position on that, which is first, by then the Soviet Union program was already at an advanced stage, and there was very little that it could contribute to on the basis of the knowledge he had put together before the defection. And secondly, we also have to consider the position of Soviet authorities. I mean, someone defects, come to your country, what do? You immediately put him in contact with secret research. It is unlikely. And actually, he was always kept, if you want, away from the kind of core issues that Soviet physicists were covering in the context of their own nuclear weapons program. There's also a period when he was essentially missing, that actually nobody knows where he was. Probably was, again, questioned by Soviet authorities, Soviet intelligence services, just to make sure that eventually bringing this prestigious nuclear physicist in your own country wouldn't actually mean that it would become a security threat fundamentally for the Soviet Union. So that's I think what his story is about.
So he hadn't built himself a reliable reputation. I'm wondering what the fallout was like in the US and in the West in general, and what that fallout tells us about the anxieties, or these new anxieties of the sorts of change that's happening in the kind of things that scientists are now seen as a part of.
I mean, it's obviously a period of massive change internationally. Atomic weapons become a weapon of diplomacy. That's something that is widely known with the introduction for the first time of the term atomic diplomacy. The idea that atomic weapons can be a device to influence international relations even before being something to be used. It's important to remember that nuclear weapons have not been used for over the last 60 years. They've never been used since in war operations since the explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the kind of military use has never been as important as, over this period, the diplomatic use, the use in international relations. And this is important because this is a time where the U.S. administration is essentially facing this massive dilemma. Whether go towards a program of stockpiling nuclear weapons and through that stockpiling asserting fundamentally its worldwide leadership through a position of monopoly of atomic weapons, which is exactly the position where the United States find itself between 1945 and 1949, or rather go for a policy of international control. Again, worth mentioning again Oppenheimer, who, with other important colleagues internationally, such as Niels Bohr, at this point in time become champions of international control. They say, this is a weapon which has devastating effects in practical terms, but also in terms of changing completely the landscape of international relations. Why don't we then introduce an international kind of initiative that would allow then to share the information available on atomic weapons with everyone else in the world, and in that way fundamentally prevent, especially obviously they're thinking of the Soviet Union, prevent anyone from using these weapons in the future. Whether it was, something that was entirely unfeasible, that didn't, could not be implemented from the viewpoint of new policies, it's something that history has shown fundamentally. And by 1950, the dream of Niels Bohr, Oppenheimer, and others of international control is shattered. We go towards a process of nuclear proliferation. But again, going back to your question, the United States administration is facing that huge dilemma right now, and that dilemma is essentially at the core of the decisions taken with regards to anything ranging from how to deal with scientists, and atomic scientists especially, how to deal with other countries, how to deal, for instance, with the development of an atomic energy program, whether it be about whether to stockpile uranium, whether to put together nuclear reactors. I mean, all of that depends on that crucial decision. And so this is this crucial dilemma that is driving then many of the things that happen, including the cases of atomic espionage, the way the U.S. administration dealt with the atomic espionage cases that we just discussed.
So top secret information has been a long feature of warfare for as long as warfare has been a thing. And having an edge on your enemy has always been a huge thing. But in modern states or in the modern times, normally that was confined to people with secret information within the state. What's different here is we are dealing with scientists with secret information just by virtue of their knowledge of the field. More akin to maybe the way Venice would have treated its glassmakers, where it's like seen as a strategic industry, which if leaked, they lose. The state then loses its power. So this idea of minds, having to protect the minds of others with a knowledge base. So it's not like they're working for the state necessarily seeing secret documents, but just their knowledge of a scientific topic making them a security risk. Is this something that rears its head as a new issue in the 1950s, or is this something that has always been there and the stakes are just kind of bigger?
Okay, there's two answers to this question. Okay, the first answer is what I just said, namely that certainly weaponry has been around for some time, and weaponry obviously when combined with innovation can lead individual countries to other win conflicts. I mean, that's been the case for centuries. I'm not an expert in what happened in modern history, but yes, I mean, we can confirm what you're saying about the Venetians and the glass making. There's plenty of other examples. But it is important to stress that there's a really something huge that happens with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Namely that for the first time, we start to have a type of weaponry that it really represents a moment of change in terms of how much explosive energy can be piled up in one single device. And while we can't see that as hugely decisive in the period immediately after 1945, when it is just one weapon in the sets of weapons available mainly to the United States. Things start to change quite dramatically when we introduce, for instance, thermonuclear weapon, hydrogen bomb, from 1952 onwards. These are weapons with a destructive power that would evaporate entire cities. And when they combine with the dynamics of escalation and, for instance, mutually assured destruction, strategies adopted by the two Cold War contendants. We start to have a situation where we start to think, will there be a tomorrow? And so this is the big difference that atomic weapons make. They're not simply weapons that would enable to win a conflict, but actually we start to think of weapons that could wipe out humankind. So that there is where there's a significant change. Now, scientists themselves obviously have a prominent role in all of this, both as those that are responsible for designing those weapons, but also those that, because of this responsibility, start to also develop ethical, political, moral issues that they want to deal directly and become political actors about, political advocates about, individually and also through their own associations, making a case that essentially a policy solution has to be found on this. So this is what, in a sense, propelled these scientists from a domain, if you want, of single individual working in laboratories in the context of a framework of production of knowledge into social actors, protagonists, individuals who wants to play a role. And so this is, I think, where we can see the difference. The glassmaker, the Venetian glassmaker, could stay in the glass-making laboratory, and there was the place where it would inform what's happening in the world around him. The atomic scientist is someone that doesn't just stay in a laboratory, doesn't just design a type of weaponry. It's someone who goes out there, speaks about the circumstances, try to mobilize the public opinion on certain positions. Just let's step forward 20, 30 years when Carl Sagan, for instance, become an advocate for a reduction of nuclear weapons in the United States based on his estimates of nuclear winter being kind of permanent global modifications deriving from a nuclear exchange between superpowers. He is clearly playing a political role, and it's a political role that, to my knowledge, is unprecedented, and probably is presented just because of what Niels Bohr did earlier, Oppenheimer did earlier. Pontecorvo probably through the defection rather than through words did earlier. So it's a new political role internationally that scientists can play because of the results of the research.
I think what you raise here is actually very important and is worth further exploring, because nuclear physics is famously opaque and complicated. It's orders of magnitude more difficult than previous specializations for the average person to wrap their head around. So, as you mentioned, we have people from this profession, self-appointed to some degree, acting as advocates for one view or another. It's a very small community, and essentially the public and to some degree politicians are trusting their view and their judgment on these topics. But like we know with topics that everyone else can wrap their head around, judgment varies very widely between people who can understand the topic. But here, we're relying on an in-house understanding and judgment on their own topic and their own way of seeing the world. And like I say, because it's quite small, you have a certain, or there can be a certain amount of groupthink when it comes to these kinds of things. To what degree, where do the politicians and the people have the ability to insert themselves in these kind of judgments when we now have something that's so important and so opaque, which is being in-house judged and adjudicated?
I mean, this is ongoing research. This is not something where historians of science and technology have put their heads on in ways that have been saying, this is the discriminating factor, this is where the politician ends, this is where the scientist begins, this is where they interact, this is how. There's various positions. Some point, for instance, at the expertise of scientists as the decisive factor. The scientist is what tells things how they happen, and the politician follows. Others obviously are far less naive and understand that then politicians take on various types of expertise and follow what also is in line with their own, political profile. So there isn't a kind of final answer to that question. But again, I mean, if you allow me, this is another, the fact that there isn't an answer is evidence of the need to research further these issues, which I think it is exactly where I think some of the research I'm doing with colleagues is very helpful. Understand that at least from that very moment, 1945, but even from before, being a scientist is no longer just something that presents you with tasks which have to do with the laboratory, but that pushes the scientist outside the laboratory as a public figure, as someone that can influence national affairs and international affairs. This is where I think it's important to understand, where we can work from now on and develop new research showing a little bit more about this. And we've actually started seeing through the study of various organizations how that can happen in different ways. So, for instance, if you think of an organization like Pugwash, Pugwash is considered internationally one of the scientists-led organizations that have always been a key advocate for nuclear disarmament. Born from the first meeting on science and world affairs, the name already tells you a great deal, in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. That's why it's Pugwash. But interestingly, we see in Pugwash scientists, atomic scientists, colleagues of Bruno Pontecorvo, acting informally. They never have the endorsement of their governments. They never go in and say, all right, fine, that's what the government tells us. We can inform governments with what we say. It's always informal. It's always an informal domain of diplomacy where they act fundamentally as themselves and collectively say, right, fine, on the basis of the estimates, we can say that we have that risk right now. With regards to atomic weapons, we could do this. Okay? That's one sphere. There's other spheres, more direct, where countries come into negotiations on atomic weapons, on environmental issues, on climate change, right? And they use the scientists directly as experts in intergovernmental meetings. It's a different interaction, if you think. It's a different way to deal with diplomatic issues, because then they represent government positions, and they represent in those government positions a clear position. Now, so you start to see that we start to have various diplomatic landscapes and scenarios. On the one hand, the informal scientists that say, we must do something, and they act together and informally inform the diplomatic world, the direct intergovernmental initiatives that are directed by government through scientists, and there's even interactions between the two. For instance, Pugwash scientists eventually, after many meetings, ended up dealing and leading on disarmament initiatives by the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, because exactly of that knowledge accumulated through informal meetings. So there's all sorts of various scenarios that you can have when you start to see the scientist as this public figure in international affairs, which is, again, something new and worth exploring, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I know that your main domain of study is international affairs, but I'm very interested in the democratic side of it, of things, because there are more and more domains which, like nuclear physics, are very opaque and not well known to the public, the details of which are not well known to the public, increasingly complicated, and sometimes these domains are quite niche, and sometimes they are quite contested and quite big. How do we deal as democratic countries or societies with increasing amounts of decision making that needs to be made on increasingly complex topics, from climate change to viruses and pandemics to AI to all sorts of really very important life-changing effects? To some degree, the public has very little input and is being almost led and told by these experts. And to some degree, the public has very little input into these decisions and into the judgments made. Because unlike some people think that science is just the uncovering of knowledge that's already there, there's a lot of judgment that goes into these things, as can be seen when topics become more debated and the nuances start to get pulled out. How do we deal with this from a democratic perspective?
That's a very good question, and actually, in contrast with what we discussed before, not something that I've been developing in my research enough, probably, to give you a substantial answer. My sense is that there is an underlying problem which is much bigger than the scientific community itself, namely that scientific ideas, knowledge, facts, assessments about risks, whether on nuclear proliferation or climate change, have been spreading in society and accompanied by competing, sometimes opposing communication, pieces of communication regarding the science underlying, those problems. And essentially, there's first of all a problem of how communication travels across society, across communities, how that communication then informs decisions made, and that's a problem, I think, that might or might not relate directly to the scientific community, as in scientists themselves have obviously launched various programs of communication to wider audiences. There's obviously impact programs everywhere that tends to kind of offer that information, but whether that's enough or not is something to be seen. If we travel across the world, both in developed countries such as the United States, to less developed countries, we still see evidence of a great deal of lack of knowledge on these issues, or of misleading information. So that's one problem, but it's a problem that doesn't really relate just to the scientific community itself. I think it's bigger than that.
Oh, I think the problem is that the knowledge that's being put out is being curated very often by the people who have done the research and therefore control the information that they're putting out.
And on that, I'm to some extent in agreement with you. I mean, there's evidence that we have, for instance, about the ways in which decisions have been made today, even in this country, about, for instance, the development of the atomic program, where we see the decision-making process increasingly being removed from not just the public, but, for instance, from Parliament, in light of we can't tell you certain things, but we can't tell you everything because, obviously, of security circumstances. And at that point, is essentially removing from the Parliament a right that should belong to Parliament to actually make decisions, final decisions about these programs. And there is where we start to see really, I think, a big problem with the circulation of communication that would allow, as you say, a democratic management of these issues. I entirely agree with that. That right now, the problem of how scientific communications travel across the world is also a problem of democracy. I would entirely agree with that. And we need solutions, and we need solutions fast.
Yeah, and maybe even as there are more and more domains that become more and more complicated, even the feasibility of their, even theoretically being able, for the public being able to have a handle on all of these things. The reason we have experts is because each topic is so complicated, it requires people to dedicate themselves. As they become even more complicated and more into the weeds, each one, at some point, we're getting very close now to a place where it's not really possible to kind of have a handle on all of these things. And maybe, sorry, go on.
No, that complexity becomes a fig leaf, in a sense, to avoid make those decisions and help people to understand and decide themselves on these issues. So we need to be really careful, I think.
So let's move this on to something that is much more in your wheelhouse, on diplomacy and international affairs. Killing people is something under the laws of war which are fairly tightly regulated. And I'm wondering if what was in the past a direct enemy would have been a soldier in front of you, or maybe a commander behind the lines making decisions for the soldiers on the ground. The legitimacy of targeting people behind the decisions or behind the soldiers was always seen as part of the nature of war. Now, as war increasingly relies on semi-civilian people like scientists, to what degree does that now change what could be seen as legitimate in terms of killing, maybe, or assassinating, which is becoming increasingly common, people who are behind scientific projects which affect the battlefield?
I wouldn't condone anyone's assassination. But that's me as a person. So I mean, I won't comment on that. I can perhaps, on the basis of what I've been learning and studying and researching, perhaps explain what's going on a little bit better. As in, so I've already explained that scientists, because of partly what happened with atomic weapons, but even from before, become fundamentally international actors. This role as international actors is partly connected to their advocacy, but this role is also connected to their own expertise. And I mean, there have been studies that, relatively recently have clarified what that makes a scientist something different when they travel. They move. Because much of, for instance, the sociological knowledge on this has been pointing at their tacit knowledge. Okay, tacit as something that cannot be replicated to writing, cannot be put in words, in equations, in formulas, in numbers. It's their own skills. Okay, skills are not easily replicable or reproducible into societies, so these skills make them unique. And obviously, being so unique, become also uniquely targetable in all sorts of operations. We know obviously that there's not atomic weapon engineers and scientists out there that can help in nuclear weapons programs or even peaceful nuclear programs. It's a very selective number of individuals who have a certain kind of training, learning, skills, their own tacit knowledge. So if we follow the theory that tacit knowledge becomes so vital to a number of specific strategic sectors of the scientific enterprise, then we come to realize that ultimately we can also explain not the assassination, that to me again is not explainable, but certainly the attention that they receive, and perhaps all sorts of operations that come with it, including the one you've described.
I mean, again, I'm not sure if this is perfectly within your wheelhouse, but the reason I mention assassination is because this is a legal category. Certain things are legal under the Geneva Convention, under international law and the laws of war, and certain things aren't. And I wonder at what point scientists are so vital to the prosecution of a war that they then become relevant targets?
I would welcome supervising a project on the legality of it. I would also claim that I don't know much about the legality of it, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
So if we go back to the idea of strategic science, I guess nuclear physics was one of the first big strategic sciences on the international stage. I wonder how you see the sorts of after effects of that, and today what sorts of sciences are, again, I could just put that out there, AI and things like that. What sort of sciences are now at the forefront of what you might call strategic science?
I would say that the kind of, for the reasons that I've already explained, the ways in which nuclear physics and nuclear weapons presented us with essentially the possibility of utter destruction, also, of humankind as we know it, I think is still something very distinctive. Certainly, we've come through all sorts of other means of warfare, chemical warfare, bacteriological warfare, that have promised radical changes, but not to the level, I think, of nuclear warfare. We are looking at artificial AI intelligence, obviously with increasing concern and anxiety. The integration of artificial intelligence into all sorts of warfare operations is something that we are starting to see the effects of, for instance, with the recent conflict in Iran, where, we've had the bombing of civilians and even children because of essentially the use of AI. But I think it's too early to say. Historians are always, 30, 40 years behind. So asking an historian what he thinks of AI, it's kind of problematic because we don't know. We just see what's happening right now and commenting as any other layperson on these issues. I don't think we can claim to have an expertise on AI as historians of science and technology that would allow us to make an assessment of how it's been used and how problematic it is from the viewpoint of strategic science, warfare, and things like that.
From the history of atomic science, is there anything to be learned about where people take responsibility for various things that happen? So obviously with AI we haven't seen how these things play out, but maybe some of the underlying ideas from previous strategic sciences and the history of science can inform us on how we should, or through what filter we should look at these newer developments.
There's a huge amount of responsibility in what atomic scientists do, and doesn't have to be seen necessarily in terms of building weapons, but actually also, for instance, in checking whether other countries have been building weapons illegally, outside the norms of international conventions. In everywhere around the world, there's plenty of countries that are not parties, for instance, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's the International Atomic Energy Agency that constantly sends atomic scientists across the world just to check where programs are developing, and in that respect, trying to ensure that we move towards a mechanism of deproliferation, and we kind of face and oppose, especially what we've been calling it as horizontal proliferation, namely the proliferation across various nations that did not possess nuclear weapons before and shouldn't do it in the future. So the question of responsibility is a larger question that has to do with fundamentally how is it that we build international organizations, mechanism, both intergovernmental and non-governmental, that allows to control, monitor, put under surveillance programs that can be problematic from that viewpoint, and hopefully prevent them.
I want to talk about the attitude of the public and your perception of how the risk is changing over time. there used to be, at least from the way that the literature appears to present it, a real dread and a fear of nuclear weapons use, which seems to be somewhat diminishing, both in terms of popular culture and the sorts of videos you might see on YouTube or just out in the kind of out in the wild, if you like, about how dangerous these weapons really are, or the diminishment of how dangerous they are, and also between governments about how far governments are willing to go to push their luck with testing and treaties breaking down, etc. What's your perception of where we are in this kind of risk?
I would make 2 points. Again, 2 points. Something that historians, and not just science and technology, have come across recently is that nuclear weapons haven't just produced this new world where fundamentally there is the risk of annihilating another country or even the whole world just by pushing the button. But also a world that is fundamentally legitimizing the fact that some countries are entitled to have nuclear weapons and others don't. That makes some custodian of that atomic knowledge, and others that actually can be seen just as kind of pariahs that are not allowed to have that knowledge. And is a way of looking at these things that is being increasingly being criticized, as in obviously not in the way that everybody should have that knowledge, but the opposite way, the way of saying we should all work together towards a process of deproliferation that makes those weapons something that is no longer available across the whole world.
But is that even something that's feasible? I mean, the problem with the non-proliferation argument for all these years is it only takes one actor to secretly decide to keep a couple behind. It's not something which is, like all things in international law, to be enforceable. You have to have at least one or two great superpowers.
We have the means. We have now bodies of, as I mentioned earlier, atomic scientists who work on a 24-hour basis to make sure that prevention mechanism is in place. We need to expand it further as we go over, further in time, and make sure that everybody contributes to that. I mean, that's my perhaps naive view, that to have a few keep having those weapons is exactly what makes many others wanting them.
Well, wouldn't you argue that the genie is out the bottle? The knowledge is out there. We've had countries develop nuclear weapons in secret. We've had even countries like North Korea recently, under every kind of blockade possible, managed to develop nuclear weapons. The science is much more accessible. Knowledge in general is more accessible. This is not something, you can have all the scientists in the world, but ultimately if the knowledge is out there, someone is going to manage to do this. And I just wonder if the idea is to have control from responsible superpowers, if you like, as opposed to trying to undo knowledge which is already out there.
But how responsible countries can be. I mean, at the end, we are still at the mercy of that sense of responsibility. And what if that sense of responsibility is no longer there, which could happen? We know that, we can trust, our own politicians only to a certain extent, especially now, right? So we are putting those weapons in the hands of people that we perceive as being very responsible, but we really don't know. I'd rather not do that. But that leads me to my second point, which is even more important, namely that what you mentioned earlier with regards to our own knowledge, understanding of what that means in terms of using nuclear weapons. 1945 is the last time we used them. the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are with us forever, as in obviously the Hibakusha, the victims of the bombing, have over the years explained how absolutely terrible the experience of nuclear bombing is, even on the small scale of A bombs rather than H bombs. Yeah? But that knowledge is vanishing, that knowledge is disappearing, that knowledge is going away with that generation. New generations of politicians, of decision makers, of the public don't even know what the effects of nuclear weapons are. And that's the danger, that in combination with artificial intelligence, we might have tomorrow some politicians saying, oh yeah, of course, we have option A, which is, guns, option B, which is, submarines, and option C, which is atomic weapons. There are three military options which are comparable. Let's go for C. And this is exactly what we want to avoid, because exactly we want to avoid in the future anyone from using these weapons, as has been the case for the last 60 years. And it's becoming increasingly difficult, in the lack of that understanding, to make people understand that that kind of option should not longer be on the table. So that's the reason why, going back to your second question, I think we need to move for all countries, and not just for certain countries, towards a process of proliferation. And the countries that have nuclear weapons today should take the lead on that process, increasingly reducing the number of nuclear weapons rather than, unfortunately, as it seems to be the case, increasing them.
So one last pushback on this idea of non-proliferation or decommissioning all atomic weapons. The rules of power dictate that states have to. Ultimately, power is what makes things enforceable. Above the police, you have to have a government. Above governments, we have international law. But all of that is only enforceable if there is someone with hard power behind it to enforce it. North Korea is a great example of a country where didn't want to engage with any sort of international organizations, had enough conventional weapons to deter any kind of invasion, and then any country that puts themselves in that situation within a world where no one else has nuclear weapons now becomes the only countries, which almost encourages this kind of delinquent behavior on the international stage, where countries who decide not to engage with scientists, don't engage with international treaties, have enough conventional weapons to keep themselves from being invaded or put in under a policing action by the international community, which again, we're already seeing the international community breaking down its ability to enforce anything, never mind a country that's hell-bent on getting nuclear weapons. So that will just create a world where you have the sort of delinquent, crazy countries all having nuclear weapons, and the sorts of sensible superpowers then being the ones without them.
Historians are not philosophers. They don't depart from principles that are applicable across the whole world. They depart from processes, historical processes that we see. I don't know how to deal with North Korea, as much as I don't know how to deal with other countries, for instance Israel, that have been in the same situation in terms of having nuclear weapons over a number of years without agreeing to the NPT, and creating clearly a massive problem in terms of international legislation on nuclear weapons. I don't know. I'm just saying, as an historian, we've had processes in place, especially from the 1980s, that have allowed us to decrease massively the number of nuclear weapons available around the world, with the contribution of the United States, of the then Soviet Union, and later on Russia in all its forms in which it developed. That process needs to continue. That's all I'm saying. How to deal with North Korea? I don't know. But I know that unless that process continues, we will be in big troubles soon.
I want to move on to another area of your research, which is very important and very interesting, and I think becoming increasingly important as technology develops, which is the democratization of data and the access to knowledge and information across the world especially the global south, in much of the research you have been doing. Maybe we can start by introducing what the International Geophysical Year is and why you started this kind of topic from this example, and maybe we can explore it through that.
So yes, this is another chapter in my research. It is not about nuclear weapons. It's not about atomic scientists defecting anywhere. But the International Geophysical Year was this important event happening in 1957, extending for 18 months, so it's sometimes described as International Geophysical Year 1957-1958. And it was essentially an exercise where the national committees, scientific committees of a number of countries came together to carry out research and collecting data on anything ranging, for instance, from the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, so is a precursor of early climate change research, was in the IGY, to, for instance, the state of the oceans, the amount of salinity or the depth of currents, anything on geomagnetism, on seismology. All the aspects and features of the Earth were essentially being covered during that time, collecting data and extracting those data, and in that way making it possible for us to know a great deal more about how the Earth works as a kind of scientific object. There is where, though, again, let's inject the diplomacy element into the story, because this is what intrigued me. Most of the histories of the IGY have been seen exactly as I described them to you, as stories of great advance of scientific progress and stories where scientists became, the protagonists of this worldwide adventure. But there's also, a kind of interesting diplomatic element that they added to it. We are in the middle of the Cold War. Nations are divided, East and West. Science brought the scientists together, because obviously the Americans and Soviets were both parts to the IGY, so they were contributing and collaborating in extracting those data. I mean, in my research, I've tried fundamentally to kind of unpack that myth of, scientists build diplomatic relations there where the politicians can't, and trying to look a little bit more critically at how the circumstances of the IGY happened. And rather than connecting to the Cold War, as most historians of science have done so far, I've connected them to decolonization, the process whereby countries around the world started to claim independence. We have the breaking up of the colonial empires that had existed up until the Second World War, and the creation of these new independent states, many of which obviously looked at science and scientific development as a way to actually gain the economic independence that would allow them to thrive as new nations. And so what I've tried to do is to say, hold on, how did the IGY mapped onto all of this? And my answer was intriguing, namely that while we, see this kind of a narration of the IGY as world uniting, we're all together doing science, actually there were a few countries, especially the leading developed countries, the United States, Britain, Soviet Russia, France, leading the game, deciding where fundamentally the data should be collected and where should be stored, and the rest of the country is making kind of flimsy appearances, marginalized from the decision-making process, and actually also confronted when they said, hold on, these data could actually help us to develop. Countries such as India, for instance, taking the lead in that kind of group of developing countries and say, these data could help us, give them to us. And then through a number of decisions actually being marginalized from the decision-making process.
I was going to say, didn't India not actually have really any issue with where the data was? They were more worried about the issues of the Arctic becoming a kind of place where superpowers would so they at the time seemed, from what I understand, less concerned about the data side of thing and much more concerned about the issues of the Arctic being colonized by the great powers.
So, first of all, to cut the story short, the IGY gave us the world data centers where essentially the data would be physically stored as a result of the IGY as an exercise. But these world data centers, when you start to look at this issue, were set up only in the United States, Soviet Union, Japan, and Western Europe, one in Australia. So only a few countries had these repositories which were deemed to be serving all the scientists of all the world. But clearly, if you're based in India and you want to travel to one of those centers to get the data, you had to spend quite a lot of money beyond obviously being actually not in a position to access them directly. We are talking obviously of a time of pre-digital data, so it wasn't just, they were not available at one click if you want from your laptop, okay? So that was one point. Indian representatives in the IGY complained about a number of issues. They wanted, obviously, a different system of geographical distribution of world data centers that would serve them as much as the developed countries. And beyond that, there were, yes, other issues that had to do not with the Arctic, with Antarctica, which obviously was closer to India. And they wanted to administer through a system that was run by the United Nations. This is a parallel story. Another way for them to assert that ultimately the United Nations should really become the body through which major decisions about science and technology in this period of development of the Cold War should have been taken, whereas developed countries were obviously saying, oh, well, why United Nations? I mean, let's do it on our own. So this kind of two-tiered approach that emerges in the colonization period really intrigues me. The way in which every country is deemed to be able to partake in the process, in the global scientific enterprise. But in partaking, some countries actually have more rights than others, okay? So that's it, that level of inequality, those imbalances are really kind of pushing my research on science diplomacy right now forward, are becoming more of an element that I want to explore, uncover, research. Why is that scientists have always been portraying the scientific enterprise in this way that shows that everybody can be part of? We are outside the political game. The political game doesn't involve us. We just do things, together, whether we are based in India or in China or in the United States. We all work together. We're all scientists. But then when you start to see how the game evolves, you start to see that actually if you're a scientist in one place, you have more rights of citizenship to the scientific enterprise than scientists in other places. And that's something that I think I'll be studying more in the years to come. I really want to understand why that happens and how it happened historically.
I wonder, well, two questions here.
The IGY is obviously a key case for that.
Yes. Two questions here.
Yeah.
One is, doesn't that imbalance purely reflect where the original centres of science were? Obviously, science started in northwestern Europe and proliferated throughout the world. At that time, most of the scientists were in that place. And then to the second point you were raising about how science is sort of proliferating around the world and who gets to contribute, isn't there an unspoken element here that actually science is often a cover for countries, governments, to do research which is useful in a geopolitical way, so military research, etc., etc. And we see many militaries and governments sponsoring science because it helps them do what they do. So actually science isn't this neutral thing which is just about uncovering knowledge, but actually there's a huge geopolitical element to science. So we have this geopolitical issue, but also just on the distribution, where the scientists were is where the centres were. And the good evidence of that would be Japan. They're not a colonial power. Japan is a freshly conquered power. They have been at that point. They're just been
I would
reset.
be careful there. Let's leave aside the military because I mean it's something we discussed extensively so far. But let's be also, for instance, see where my research comes from, which obviously is research in the colonization period where countries start to be independent. But science has by then been helping the colonial enterprise extensively, which is exactly what justifies the circumstances that you're describing. It's not just that, oh, yes, I mean, science developed so much in Europe because, Europeans are better at doing science. It's just that they had the resources. They had, for instance, if you're thinking about just thinking about, for instance, biology and the development of biology, botanics, for instance, they had the means to transfer certain species, certain plants, certain floras and fauna from other colonies into the metropoles and start that research that couldn't be started anywhere else.
I want to interject very quickly, if I may, about what you're saying, whether Europe was better at science. They developed the scientific method. So in some degrees, at that time, yes, they were better at science. They also had more access to the world to be able to, like you say, gather more stuff. But the actual scientific method and the whole project of modern science originated there.
In parallel with colonization and colonialism, so I wouldn't distinguish between a methodological and ideological project and what it was a project of power and exploitation that brought colonial powers around the world. There's connections that exist between the means that allowed colonization. I wouldn't recall the uses of the telegraph, for instance, in colonial Africa, because are widely known. This is just to say that the two projects run in parallel. It is not really my research to say what are the points of contact and the points of divergence. That's not something I've been researching extensively, so I would perhaps speculate if I was going to tell you. But there are two projects that run in parallel, and for what I've been looking at into my research in the decolonization period, they are decisive in shaping power relations between developed countries and developing countries, which actually, in contexts such as the United Nations, keep constantly grumbling and protesting and contesting about the ways in which developed countries continue to use science and technology as means for further development, ignoring quests coming from underdeveloped and the developing countries to use it as means for development. The ways in which they continue to evade questions and overlook questions of equality and balance in the distribution of scientific infrastructure and resources, it's just mesmerizing. It's just something that makes you realize that colonial power ended with colonization, but actually that continued through influence that developed countries scientifically and technologically could play towards underdeveloped countries rather than ended once and for all. So would it be fair to say that science and technology allowed to materialize what the kind of neo-colonial project that people like Kwame Nkrumah, for instance, from Ghana, pointed out was in place? There is room for research that would prove that, I think. There is where I think my research is going, and not my research, but many of us working in this area are really concerned with that kind of analysis.
To your mind, do you think that this is a function of power, colonial mindset, or some sort of ideological dominating mindset, or is this a function of wealth and the concentration of where expertise and wealth existed, and therefore has nothing to do with colonial issues per se, but more an issue of wealth and distribution of wealth.
That's a bigger issue. The directions of science have been set by the scientists themselves in various periods of time. We've decided to invest in certain fields, certain areas of research rather than other. Why we have, for instance, advanced studies across the world in certain fields, but for instance, major issues that have to do, for instance, with the health of certain countries, certain population. It's something we don't look into that. It's something that reflects, I think, also that kind of imbalances. The more we select and kind of create density into centers for scientific productions which have a certain agenda, the more we overlook and evade the scientific needs of other countries, other groups, other populations. So in a sense is a kind of circular process whereby you accumulate scientific infrastructure and power. Through accumulating, you create questions and agendas for scientific research that are in line with that accumulation. And on the contrary, at the periphery of that process, you have countries which have far less capacity and that cannot actually set even those questions into the agenda because of that lack of capacity. So it's a kind of imbalance that intrigues me, and I want to research further.
Imagine you had a long line here of bright, young, fresh PhD students. What about the modern state of this topic, science, data, and inequality in these areas? What would be your top three sort of areas that you'd be interested for someone to really do a deep dive into what's going on right now, which could illuminate about where we stand on these topics and what the kind of major things we might worry about in the coming years should be?
Okay, first of all, I would take a more responsive approach, I would say. One of the things that I've learned through looking at science as diplomacy by other means is that we should really stop that process whereby we select topics and we assign topics to PhDs. We listen to PhDs and we start to understand what they want, especially those coming from other countries, other world regions, and we actually learn from them rather than just, that, you work for me. It's just like, I'm at the center of the process. You work for me and I'll get. So the question of what kind of topics are central, it's something that I've learned to be responsive about. Working, for instance, with one of my PhD, Carrington Kinyanjui from Kenya. He's, very well versed, for instance, in scientometrics, the quantitative studies of science. And I just listen sometimes to what he says and says, oh yeah, I want to take my research there. Right, interesting, let's go there. Other times I've been telling him, maybe not there. But it's in the, I think we need to also rethink, as part of the process that I mentioned, that kind of, assertive, I wouldn't call it colonial, but we call it assertive approach to research in the global scientific enterprise, which is, I'll tell you how I want to develop this, and start to listen from PhDs coming from, in my case, from Brazil, from China, I've just given them prompt. This is a problem that we've seen. How do you see this? And then letting them take control of their own research agenda.
Just a shout out to Manchester University, because in the humanities department they've just changed the system. Yeah. So it used to be PhD students came with their topics to their supervisors, but for some reason, very recently, I think what the university is trying to do is make research more coherent. They've now put the onus on the supervisors to have topics that they are interested in researching as part of a wider project, and sort of foisting that upon or offering that to students, which, like I say, controversial, and every university has its own idea of how these things should be done. But I'm just curious what you think are the topics that should be researched. What's at the frontier now? What are the things you're worried about? We have
agriculture, health. For instance, we come to realize regularly that, for instance, in fields such as medicine, topics that, for instance, are more akin to diseases, problems by male, are far more researched than problems, diseases experienced by women. I mean, there is an area, for instance, where I think we need more investment. I mean, I'm just making examples here.
Yeah, these are the sorts of interesting things. I just want to leave the viewers when they go away with a kind of list of things to kind of mull over. So we're talking about, like you say, health, agriculture, and
there aren't lists. There is a process again, and there is where, for instance, I've started saying, let's do something. How do we select data for research, for instance? Should be me and you here in this room doing it? Or should it be, for instance, democracy? Or should it be, for instance, a group of people that meets somewhere in a space and tells, we need this and this and this? We started talking about observatories, research coming out from observatories that collects evidence on what data are needed, what are the priorities. And then we set the research on the basis of those priorities. We need to turn upside down the mechanism through which research is done globally. And it's a big challenge. It is about no longer just listening the few that can actually set the research agenda, but listening the many who can't. And so, I mean, it's not for me to say this and that. I'm not giving you an example if that's what you want. I'm giving you a process, a model, a policy, which is to listen more in carrying out research to the needs of those that actually need certain types of research.
So I guess your kind of research is very relevant to academic institutions and policymakers and educators. These are the sorts of people who we need to get this kind of information out to. But like I say, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time. It's been absolutely fascinating. And as you come out with more research and uncover new knowledge, I'll be more than pleased to have you back on and to update us all on any updates you may have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And obviously, if the PhDs you mentioned earlier are interested in what we are doing with science diplomacy, obviously they're free to come and get in touch with me on my email address, because obviously I'm very welcome to listen.
Absolutely. Thank you, Simone.
Yeah, thanks.